Welcome, everybody, and thanks for listening in or looking into the second out of our four webinars related to cultural storytelling. This one is storytelling, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We're going to look at a couple of examples and a couple of options for students and volunteers and community members related to your museum or connected with your museum or institution or program alike to see what are the options and what to do and what not to do. This webinar is being recorded. If you have any questions, we will have a moment possible for questions at the end. Feel free to unmute your microphone when we mention it. Until then, it's the best to just stay mute, listen to me and my colleague Heather, and of course you can always email us at the end. So as I mentioned, Heather Shelton, who will be taking most of the lead of this presentation, our digital curator at the MuseWeb Foundation. This webinar is produced in combination with the Museum on the Main Street program and the YAG, the Youth Access Grant related to that program. I myself am Selwyn Ramp. I'm the project director for the Be Here programming. So let's dive in immediately. And I put this slide up 2 weeks ago in the first webinar, but I briefly wanted to return to it because what is cultural storytelling? Cultural storytelling can really be about buildings, but also it's about experience. It's about what that burger tastes like. And how is it different from other stories? How is it not the stories that perhaps are even directly presented in your museum on the wall labels? Or how is it not news story online, though sometimes we wonder if that is also cultural storytelling at this point. We looked last week a little bit about what cultural storytelling is. And so as a quick review, cultural stories are not always based on hard facts. Not to say they cannot have hard facts in them, but it is not about this building was built in 1848. It's about the experience. It can be told by anyone because anyone has a cultural experience related to the world around them, and hopefully perspectives and experiences related to the local culture around them. These stories offer a sense of time and place. It's about the being there. It's about the little hiker on the right-hand side. It's being able to translate the dry facts into an experience. And so through using rich and descriptive texts or voices or audio or video, someone who was not there at a certain time in a certain place can experience a cultural event or a cultural happening or the way it was perceived by listening to or reading or watching these kind of stories. And so it's okay that these cultural stories are completely individualized and unique. I may have a very different cultural story related to an object, a location, or a building than, for example, my colleague Heather has, simply because we come to it with different experience prior to witnessing an event or location, and we interpret it in a different way. And cultural stories are a way to share these kind of individualized and unique experiences through a sense of the traditional storytelling methods.
So hello everybody, my name is Heather Shelton and I'm the digital curator for the MuseWeb Foundation. And over the last, I'd say year or so, we've been collecting digital content just like a regular museum would do, but the role of a digital curator is to take that quote unquote object and give it some context, to think about themes, to think about subject matter, to think about that particular asset's value. And we have listened to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of collected stories over this last year. Some of them are great and some of them are not so great. So we're going to spend the next period of the webinar talking about what makes for a great story and which stories maybe could have used some assistance and ended up being not quite so successful because of the certain things that were done or not done in the storytelling. So part of the role that we're going to play is to sort of give you a rubric or a checklist for what makes a great story. First and foremost, we would love for people to include the town name and the state, because while you may be familiar with the name of your town, other people may not. And particularly as you think about the shareability of these stories and the fact that the internet is indeed global, you want to give people context. Not only are you creating context for the story, but you're creating a frame of reference for anybody in the world to really understand where you're coming from. That leads us to our second point, which is creating a sense of context. So allowing your storyteller to really talk about the details, to get into the richness of the story, to get into time and place, gives people a perspective of where you are at this particular moment in time and where you are geographically. Providing rich descriptive details is definitely something that you don't want to do without. You don't want to get right into the story without providing some sense of time and place, providing a main character, giving a sense of what the problem in the story is. And all of these things, you might think of a feature-length film. You might think of what makes for a great story that you might see on the big screen. And all of these things can certainly be winnowed down, believe it or not, to a 5 to 10 minute story that you might have your students create. So think about what makes a great story on the big screen and try to apply it to your own student projects. In our case, we are dealing with cultural storytelling, just as Selwyn mentioned, but ultimately we're dealing with topics that perhaps can be linked together. And what I mean by that is, instead of giving students each a completely individualized and unique topic, it's a good thought to think about how those themes and how those topics can be linked together thematically. In other words, is it something that you can have each student in the class create a tour or create a stop for a tour ultimately, that perhaps might be a tour of your small town, or perhaps it's a series of issues that relate to a singular topic. But the idea of linking topics together to create a richer narrative is one that will ultimately help with the shareability of these stories. Here's one that cannot be understated, believe it or not, and we've come across several instances of youth access stories where there was some great storytelling, but the sound imagery didn't match the tenor of the topic. In other words, the background music was dark and foreboding, but the story itself perhaps was lighthearted. So there needs to be a certain level of parity, of matching whatever it is that you're talking about with the content, as well as the sound and the imagery. And believe it or not, that's not necessarily something that comes naturally to some people. So you really need to think about what matches, what can be paired, and what perhaps might be over the top. You really don't want to go into a dark, heavy mood if you're talking about food or something like that. So the topic needs to match the context. One thing that we find over and over again, that some of the best stories are naturally narrated, meaning it's not being read from a script. Someone is just talking very enthusiastically about a topic that they truly love. And when you combine all of these 6 elements, you get really great stories. But for the topics that you might be interested in with your particular students, you should really capitalize on the student's own passions. In other words, if a student is more passionate about that particular topic, he or she is likely to dive in headfirst and really deliver rich storytelling. Whether that storytelling is about a sports team that they have participated on, their favorite animals, a collection of armor, or perhaps they're really into digital photography. Whatever it happens to be, if you allow those passions to shine through, you really can collect and deliver some of the best storytelling around. So we thought we would troll through the archive. And again, we were looking at a base of about 11 to 1,200 stories and really pick out a few stories that exemplified what we were talking about here. And one thing that you'll find, perhaps they're spontaneous. They are spontaneously collected by a student perhaps at a live event, or they were really not intended to be documentary style stories. These were sort of spontaneous, on the fly stories in some cases, but they still deliver some of those key elements that we talked about: richness of content, passion, energy, context, etc. And these stories run anywhere from just a few seconds, literally up 45 seconds, onto about 3 minutes. So you really don't need to create feature-length films to create exceedingly rich cultural stories. So we're going to go through 3 or 4 of these stories. They're very, very short, again, ranging in time from about 1 minute to 3 minutes. And then we're going to dissect really why these stories were successful. You can agree with us or you can challenge us on these and if you think that there's something missing. But again, the idea is creating context, creating a time and a place that people can understand, and providing that passion that only an individual storyteller can understand. So let's take a listen. We've turned the volume up on our computer. So take a second to turn the volume up on your individual computers, just in case your individual computers have low volume, and then you'll be able to hear these stories even more clearly.
When I was a high school student in this would have been in the late 60s or early 70s, I worked summers at the local newspaper up in Waterloo, Maine, and I was an inserter. And what an inserter is, probably a job doesn't even exist today. It's the person that used to put the sections of the newspaper together. And you do this night after night for 3 or 4 hours, and I think we got paid about 85 cents an hour. And you had the roughest sort of people ever that you could imagine. These were the people that probably couldn't find work anywhere else, and then mixed in with kids that wanted to go on to college. So you had quite a collaboration of folks. But it was a rough group. I remember one day that somebody actually threw somebody through a window because they got upset with them. And the same person, a couple of weeks later, they tied up and set out in the mail sack with newspapers or somewhere else. So you kind of try to keep to yourself and want to make sure that you didn't get yourself in any trouble because you knew that the ramifications might not be so good. But it was a good learning experience that you realize that there are all different types of people. So it's something that's always stuck with me for the rest of my life.
So that's one of our cultural stories about a newspaper inserter, and it was connected to the Museum on Main Street exhibition, The Way We Worked, if you're familiar with that exhibition. This next story was collected in the context of small town America. So this individual storyteller, who might be very surprising once you start listening to this story, is from Eagle River, Alaska.
Oh my, I don't even know where to begin, actually. Actually, you guys won't believe this, but it's true. I live in Eagle River, Alaska, way all up there. It's really cool up here, and it's kind of cold. Right now it's about 15 degrees below. Yeah, it's kind of cold up here. But in the summer it gets about 26 degrees. It's really fun up here. We like to play this game at school. It's called Splish Splash. So where 2 people take 1 water balloon full of water, and they pass it in between each other until it pops. And you do this with a whole bunch of people, and whoever does not get their balloon popped and has it staying whole for the very last seconds wins and gets a prize. Some sort, like $1 or a whistle or something like that. But yeah, we have a lot of time in school. You can do snow machining, fishing, berry picking, you can hike mountains. The good thing about living in the valley is you can do a whole full 360 and always see mountains. It's really awesome up here. You guys should come up here sometime. It's really fun up here. It may be cold, so might want to buy some snow pants once you get up.
That story always makes me laugh. Again, from an unexpected storyteller, a very contextually rich story about Eagle River, Alaska. This is from the opposite side of the country. This is a story about a small town during an ice storm. So again, these stories cover a broad range of topics.
I didn't grow up in a small town. I moved to a small town in 2003, Temple, New Hampshire. And in December of 2008, there was an ice storm that knocked out power to the entire town at one point. And it was the rallying of everybody in town to help each other out that really showed me what small town life was all about. The elementary school opened up, and the principal cooked for days and opened up the building for hot showers and for hot food and a place to get warm. A local contractor put a generator on the back of his truck and drove around giving free power so people could heat up their house, heat up their water, and cook a hot meal. The fire department went door to door checking on people, and if there was an elderly couple or an elderly person living somewhere, they made sure their neighbors were checking on them to make sure they were okay. My wife and I, at times, were moved to tears over the care and the outpouring of aid from person to person in this town. I may not have been born in a small town, but I'm a small town person now, and I can't imagine living anywhere else.
That's really a wonderful story. Again, creating context, a sense of time and place, and a storyteller like only that individual person could tell. This last story covers a first job.
At age 16, my parents decided that I needed to get a job. I was forced to work at Monsanto, a corn research facility in Gothenburg, Nebraska. On my first day there, I was flat out irritated. I didn't want to work at all, much less outdoors in the hot sun with only one of my friends. I was excited for getting money, but the means by which I would have to do this was not appealing to me in the slightest. Even from the start, we all knew how awful it was going to be. Lunchtime seemed like it would never come. We had been doing one activity the entire time, shoot bagging, a droning, boring activity. It was getting increasingly hotter and the sun was beating down, trying its hardest to make us all combust or just burn really bad. After lunch, time seemed to go even slower if possible. We turned to harder, more strenuous jobs. Work became more painful. Now it was just torture. The lucky underage kids were sent home due to child labor laws, leaving everyone 16 and older in the field. By this time, we had worked 3 hours longer than they had told us we would have to, so we were all frustrated. Despite these dreadful ideas, eventually we were told to head back to the bus. 6 o'clock is when we were finally let off on our first day of work. Our ears, faces, and necks would never be the same due to extreme sunburn. A cold shower would never feel better. $8 an hour just didn't seem like it was enough. I swore to myself that I would never return to this forsaken place. However, it occurred to me that many farmers had to work like that every day and they probably didn't complain like this. In the end, I decided that if they could do it, so could I, and so began the hardest 3 weeks of my life.
I absolutely love that story. Not only is it told from her teen perspective, but you see that there's a sort of quintessential character shift at the end. Her perspective changes. So those were 4 very, very, very different types of stories that we listened to from this queue of 1,100 some stories. And again, there were many great examples of fantastic stories that not only had been provided by folks living in communities where traveling exhibits had appeared, but also from students coordinated and connected to the Youth Access Project. So what elements did these stories really share? Each and every one of them recounted a personal perspective or experience. That's what makes them unique cultural stories. They weren't telling a historical narrative. They weren't interpreting somebody else's words. These were events and experiences that happened in an individual's life. And in that way, it's a topic that he or she knew best. There's no way to be wrong about a personal narrative, or there's no way to be wrong about a personal perspective in many ways. So you are the expert in these cultural stories, which gives the storyteller a sense of empowerment and a sense of freedom to really tell it in their own words. In most of these cases, you heard a natural speaking voice. Now, in the last scenario, the student was reading her story, but she did it in a way that didn't seem too contrived, and she also did it in a way that was very fluid. So the natural speaking voice lends to the authenticity of these stories. And not to mention the fact that they were short. And let's face it, people are not very patient anymore when it comes to listening to lengthy content. So what we find from data analysis on sites like YouTube, that the general public really won't listen to stories that are more than 5 minutes in length unless they're incredibly captivating. And now that's not to say that the stories that students are going to be creating won't be captivating, But in most instances, what you're looking for are nuggets of information that are not only relevant, but digestible and shareable. And the real trick, as my thesis advisor used to say, is to narrow down your research or narrow down your topic so that it can really be explained in a short period of time. Anybody can write a 15-page paper, but fewer people can write a 5-page paper because you really have to take that content and synthesize it and suss out what the important details are. Each of these stories also referenced a location, whether that location was Eagle River, Alaska, or Nebraska, or a small town in New Hampshire. Each storyteller made a specific reference to a location. And in cultural storytelling, that's really where the gold is, because it does provide the context that the listener needs in order to create an accurate picture in his or her mind. And in that case, it really did make you think about another time or place. So I'm sure, particularly for the story about Eagle River, Alaska, in my mind, I was really thinking about soaring mountains and snow-covered peaks and everything that you think about when you think about Alaska, particularly as the storyteller was talking about how cold it was at that particular moment. So providing that descriptive, rich detailing really lent itself to creating a great story in that context.
There was one other aspect that actually, I think, an element that all these stories shared. They were by no means a professional production. And so the sound, we'll get back to that a little later, but the sound was, excuse me, the sound was clear enough to understand very clearly what the people were saying, but there were some imperfections there, but they were not significant enough to distract from the actual core story.
Absolutely, Selwyn. And what we have found in listening to a lot of these stories and talking to people who have recorded their own stories is that they're using everyday devices like smartphones to do so. And that's not to say that there's not an emphasis on learning more sophisticated equipment, which is important as far as 21st century skills, but smartphones are probably going to be included in that list as well. And there are simple recording features included on most smartphones that allow you to record fairly high quality audio. So that's one thing to think about. And we're going to talk a little bit about production later on, but Selwyn's absolutely right. What you didn't notice in some of these audio stories was that there was no background music and there was no audio or no video rather to this. These are purely audio stories. So you have obviously many choices when it comes to the delivery and the file type of these stories, whether you want to do audio or video. But audio is something that is perhaps a bit more accessible to most people, given the fact that it doesn't require sophisticated editing equipment. Many people can use software like Audacity, which is a free downloadable software, to work on audio editing in a very easy format, a very user-friendly format. So we'll talk about that actually in another seminar. We're going to be talking about editing and production. But just to give you a taste for what those stories include, Selwyn's absolutely right. No high production value on those is necessary. However, not every teacher is going to want to take that approach. Some teachers are really going to want to think about using that technology, the latest technology, as well as pairing that with a more traditional storytelling format. So if your students are interested in producing something more like a documentary film, you should be aware that the producers still have to be passionate about the topic. It's still all about pairing the student with the topic to maximize that level of enthusiasm. And you should still be concerned about length. We're going to look at a couple of videos that were created by students that range anywhere from about 15 to 18 minutes. While that is actually pretty short, I suppose, for a documentary film, if you want the content to be used, if you want it to be shared, which is sort of the ultimate longevity of a digital asset, right, is that it's passed around and then it's listened to, you might want to consider narrowing that to, again, anywhere between 5 and 10 minutes, even down to 3 to 5 minutes. So it's very difficult to winnow down some research sometimes, but ultimately you'll be helping to synthesize the story in a way that really makes sense for the listener or the viewer. Research matters, of course, and you want kids or students to think about going to the library, looking at historic newspaper articles, doing oral histories. But the idea of scripting may or may not be incorporated. Again, some of the stories that we listened to a few moments ago were not scripted stories. If you are indeed working on creating a layout or a script, that's absolutely a wonderful way to approach the storytelling, but perhaps not reading that script. And that can be difficult sometimes. So the level of comfort the student or the storyteller has with the script will really translate in how natural that story sounds on film or in audio. This particular point, editing to know the most important parts of the story, really relates to length as well. So if you're thinking about storyboarding a type of documentary, you want to highlight the most important elements of the story and perhaps skip the details. If you're doing a video in particular, those details can be edited out, but you really want to stick to the most important or key elements of the story that help propel the story and share essentially a beginning, a middle, and an end, just like any story that you might see in a feature-length film. And of course, context is still key. It's still critical to describe a place or perhaps talk about a time period or think about what was happening at that particular moment in history. The context is important for the storyteller. So think about anything that you might find on YouTube, for example. And it's something that ultimately can be completely random. It might be a story about a flood in the 1950s, and you click on that, and if there's no context there, you have no idea not only where the flood occurred, but perhaps you don't know that there was something happening in that town that led to the flood being more significant. So the context is actually really critical in telling this story. At the same time, it's important to really narrow down the key details in that story. So the rich details, the character development, the place, the time, all of these things really matter regardless of the length of your story, whether that story is 1 minute or 15 minutes. And again, ultimately, what it might entail is collecting a lot of that content and winnowing down to the point where you feel satisfied that the story is not only has a beginning, middle, and an end, but it has key character development and really talks about the critical moments in that particular story. So speaking of documentary style stories, these youth access stories were collected over the last year from Minnesota, and Minnesota has actually collected a tremendous number of youth stories along with Nebraska, two of the main states that have contributed wonderful youth access grant stories. But both of these stories cover essentially local history. So the coordinator of these particular stories, the mentor for the project, was very interested in documenting local history. And in this case, the students dove in passionately and discovered a lot of things, not only about local history, but about themselves in the process. And we're going to play just a few moments from each of these videos, and we're going to talk about the videos and what you saw in just a few minutes.
My name is Marilyn Jerry. I'm a city transplant, and I'm a prime example of a millennial living in a small Midwestern town, also known as Lanesboro, Minnesota. Lanesboro was created by joint stock company owners in New York, with a starting population of about 600 people. The time it was founded is very much disputed, some saying 1869 and others saying 1868. In the early years, Lanesboro was just like any other small Midwestern town. Lanesboro had everything its residents needed: somewhere to eat, somewhere to drink, somewhere to worship, and a hotel. Lanesboro grew quickly, adding a flour mill, a hardware store, general stores, and 8 saloons. That's 2 more than were allowed by law. In 1876, Lanesboro was at its peak with over 1,600.
So you see in this story, there is a traditional historic narrative here, and the storyteller goes on to talk about how that narrative has really affected her life. And so that personal aspect comes in at the very end of the story. This one takes a slightly different approach.
With the data I look at and the history that I know and the things that I've learned, I see communities constantly and consistently evolving and changing. And so I tend to think about small towns in a little bit more positive light, that it has changed a lot. It has evolved from where it has been 20, 30, 40, or 50 years ago. I know not everything's positive. I know there are problems and challenges, but I believe we need to nuance the narrative a little bit more away from just negative or revitalization, but more towards look at all these interesting things happening in all of these interesting places.
Nowhere could this be more applicable than Lanesboro, a small town with a plethora of experience with change, gleaned from the events that have taken place here in the last 40 years. This is that story.
Both really fantastic stories, and I actually encourage you to revisit the webinar after we post it and listen to those videos in their entirety. Both are about 15 minutes long, but both storytellers were looking at local history from a completely different perspective. Very, very interesting, very different approaches to storytelling. Both were highly polished productions. So if you and your students are interested in more polished productions, these are two of the best examples that we have been presented with in the last couple of years. So again, take a look at those just to make sure that you see those in their entirety. So more than the story, if we're going into the whole idea of this project and why storytelling matters, think about this. Did the process encourage your students to think beyond themselves and their school? These are really critical questions when you think about the value of the project in general and what storytelling, particularly on the local level, can really mean for student storytellers. So did it make them think of someone other than themselves or other than their school environment? Were students encouraged to consider topics not studied in school, and were they considered valid and worthwhile? What we mean by that is essentially, we all know that there are certain topics which are covered in school. Common history, as you might think of it, whereas local history isn't often included in textbooks. So is there something out there that that makes the students realize that the small town that they live in, or any town for that matter, is just as worthwhile or just as interesting as something that it might indeed read in a history book? So this gives credibility and merit to local history on the national scale. So did the project encourage students to cross generational, gender, or racial lines to collect or record the story? This is something that we're very, very interested in. We're interested in having storytelling really be the catalyst to breaking outside of oneself, to thinking about others, to going outside of one's comfort zone. And of course, at this particular moment in history, this is a very important element to think about in this process, because storytelling really and truly can be a bridge between people of different generations and different races. So this is a way of getting people to think outside their comfort zone. And in that respect as well, did students make use of local resources like libraries, archives, and museums? All too many times we have spoken with people who may not even be familiar with the wealth of resources, particularly of local history in their own communities. So part of this project, of course, is getting students involved with local archives or museums and looking at primary source materials to think about how they can write their own narratives about local and community history. Were students able to experiment with technologies with this prospect? So again, maybe a smartphone is one technology that they're interested in, but perhaps they're looking at different types of software to fine-tune their stories. Is it Audacity? Is it Final Cut Pro? Is it Adobe Premiere Elements? Is it one of those technologies where students are really thinking about 21st century skills and being able to implement and follow through with some of those new tools to really create a polished product? Were students open to peer editing, review, and screening of stories? So this is a big one, because When you're telling a personal story in particular, or you've invested a lot of time and energy in something, it can be very difficult to hear criticism of a topic that you've become so personally invested in. But part of this process, again, is about comment. It's about editing. It's about review. It's about collaboration. So when students either work together or they screen their stories, they're more open to understanding the nuances of how other people view their content or view their product. And ultimately that can be used to help revise or re-edit some of these stories so that they become ultimately even better. Did the process encourage students to consider themselves experts on a topic? Personally, I think this is actually a really critical element because so many people discount the views of young people and teens. And in this particular instance, this is an opportunity for young storytellers to really present themselves as being an expert on something that very few people might not know about or understand. So it's a confidence builder in some ways, but it's an opportunity for a youth storyteller to be in the driver's seat and really be seen as an expert in that particular topic. And finally, was the storytelling process or the story collecting process an opportunity for students to consider multiple points of view on a given issue? Again, at this particular moment in time, a really critical element in this whole process of story collecting and community building. Because what we're trying to do is to be able to not only build community, but bridge those gaps and bring people together around a common theme, regardless of whether or not perspectives are very different about a particular topic. So overall, the process of story collection and delivery for youth access can be about building confidence, building skills, and therefore building community. So 3 or 4 of the biggest elements here are really connecting people through storytelling. So let's say you've created, or your students have created, a group of fantastic stories. What should you do at this point? And again, we are going to be talking a little bit more about promoting those stories in another seminar. But perhaps it's a moment to think about grouping those stories around a theme to create a larger narrative, a cause, or even a movement.
I was just going to jump, and there are various ways to do that. I mean, there is the current online platforms that are free and open. Everything from a physical like tour or something you can wander around, but also things like a timeline that you can show on a website or even points on a map. All of those are possibilities, and in fact we have some resource sources listed on the MuseWeb website that are free downloadable and free to use for this kind of purpose, so that even though these individual stories are brief and short, the whole grouping becomes more.
Absolutely. So when you're thinking about stories that are grouped around a singular theme, perhaps in this case the theme is water, or perhaps the theme is sports, perhaps it's stories that are being collected around a specific age group, World War II veterans, or perhaps it's about a very specific place, a main street in a hometown. All of these stories can be grouped thematically to create something larger than a singular story, so that each of those stories build one upon the other. And when you think about it, if you have a singular topic, let's say it is a particular waterway in your small town, if you have your storytellers collect perspectives, multiple perspectives about a singular waterway, it could really create a narrative that has breadth and depth that you couldn't if you were just talking about a singular story. So again, multiple perspectives can allow people to really expand on this idea of just the singular story that you might be asking your students to come up with. So when you think about those multiple stories, these great stories create context that can be connected online or even developed into a collection, a playlist, or a series. sort of fodder for a future webinar that we're giving about promotion and particular platforms that are out there in the future and that exist right now that allow you to create context for these stories, group them into tours, make playlists, etc. So not that the promotion or the distribution of these stories is any more important than the production. That's not what we're saying. But the value of some of these stories has to do with how many times they're listened to, perhaps, or how long these stories are around on the internet to allow people in the future to have some interest in Lanesboro, Minnesota, or whatever the small town happens to be. You have to make the stories available to people in a way that they can digest and listen to. So context, theming, and all of those ways of connecting the content from one topic to another or one platform to another is a great way of making those stories not only shareable but usable in the long run. So if you want to think about a tour, so if you've created, perhaps you've had your students each document a particular building along Main Street in your small town. So perhaps you want to group those stories together. Maybe it's 8 to 15 stories that are connected by the common theme, which is the Main Street in your town. A typical stop is probably going to be between 1 and 3 minutes. And think about this when you're creating your stories. On what platform do you want to display those stories? Is this something that you're going to be thinking about somebody listening to on a smartphone? Are they going to be standing on their feet? Are they going to be listening on a computer? Sometimes the format that you're creating has to do with its ultimate output. So if you were thinking about something that's easily digestible by somebody using a smartphone, indeed it will be a bit shorter than it might be if somebody's sitting on their couch with a tablet. So if you can think about not only the content, not only the production, but ultimately the distribution, and you can connect all three of those, you're really going to be developing some winning stories that will ultimately have value to not only the storytellers, but also the consumers of those stories. So we've included this particular slide, and Selwyn, jump in on this as you were really the person who was involved with this project. But this is a map of various stories from Baltimore, Maryland. So each one of these pins represents a different story on a tour. So Selwyn, would you like to elaborate?
Yeah, sure. This is a tour I worked with a couple of interns on. Looked at buildings in Baltimore that used to be industrial buildings and now have somehow been redeveloped to be more artistic purpose. Whether that is artist studios or the MICA, Maryland Academy of the Arts, all these buildings have some kind of transformation from warehouse or store to some other function. So we created this kind of 11 locations that we connected with these blue lines that you see, and all those little compasses are directionals where we're saying, hey, turn left here or turn right there. From start to finish, you get a whole kind of walkable history of this neighborhood, and you're starting to see a larger scale of transformation in a neighborhood where if you look at the individual buildings, sure, you see that one or two have changed, but likely it wouldn't get you across the bridge or you see the extent of this happening.
And that's certainly something that can translate to any town really across the world, this idea of connecting these stories to create something that actually makes people move and gets people out in the cities is not only one that has value to storytellers, but also, believe it or not, to tourism boards. So think about how these stories could potentially be bigger than just the storytellers, and that also is one element of great stories. So be part of a larger community. What we certainly want people to do is upload their stories to the Museum on Main Street website, and I'm sure Shannon has worked with folks to guide them through that process. But it's very easy to do, and essentially you can upload video, audio, text, imagery, etc. it is a platform for which your content will be archived for years to come. So this is an opportunity for a student to say, hey, my story's archived at the Smithsonian, which you can't get much better than that. But in a larger spectrum, in whether it's Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, the way for people to be involved with this project, even if they're uploading content independently, is to tag their content with Be Here Main Street, or simply to use the hashtag Be Here Main Street. And that allows us to see the content that is being created for this project specifically, and to address it and potentially to tag it for our own channels as well, and resend out to our own constituents. So that's being part of a larger community. So I didn't want to end this webinar without mentioning what makes for a less successful story, because in that big pot of 1,100 stories that we've collected over the years, there have been some that really haven't made the mark, so to speak, for whatever purpose. One thing that, again, some of these are common sense, but we don't like to hear speakers talk over each other. It's very difficult to discern who is talking, and it makes the audio quality very, very poor. In this case, this is really something to grapple with as far as student privacy. We'd be less inclined to include content that includes a student's last name and address. Now you will notice, and if you go back to the webinar and listen to some of those YAG student documentaries, that at least one of the students included her full name. We talked to the mentor about that, and ultimately we would prefer, at least for Museum on Main Street website uploads, that students leave their last names out and not include their addresses. It's just a matter of privacy and student safety. It's difficult, particularly with spontaneous recording, but it's better not to record in a loud place where you have a tremendous amount of background noise. Now, if it's a little bit of noise that can be edited out, that's one thing, but if there's a constant din that really prohibits the listeners or viewers from hearing the speaker, that really drowns out the message. What if a student becomes too focused on editing bells and whistles? So if you've ever used iMovie or any of some of these fun editing tools, you really can add pretty cool effects to some of these videos. You can add Star Wars style titles and that sort of thing, but if it goes overboard, if it really eclipses the content of the story, that can become a little distracting. So we really like to focus purely on the content, and perhaps on a little bit of background music or a little bit of audio that might contribute to the overall effect, but nothing so much that it overpowers the message of the video or audio. Using unlicensed audio or video, this is a really big element, because ultimately a student could create a wonderful documentary and perhaps they decide to put Katy Perry music in the background. Well, ultimately it becomes unusable, not only for Museum on Main Street, but perhaps for you as well if you'd like to publish that somewhere, because it's using unlicensed audio content. Creative Commons content out there on the web, whether it's video or imagery, is a great place for students to think about how to incorporate free content into their videos, whether it's Flickr Creative Commons imagery or some free audio that perhaps might come from SoundCloud. We have resources for people to look at Creative Commons content on our website, and that website is www.museweb.us. There's a big section about resources, not only for Be Here Main Street, but for those that are looking for Creative Commons content to include in audio and video. So a big element there is to teach students the value of using content that is free or public domain, or how it can be cited correctly in audio and video content. And lastly, this is a big one that we've encountered, is that the interviewee, probably a student in this case, asks many yes or no questions of the person who is being interviewed. So ultimately, it doesn't create a rich story. It's just a series of questions that someone might ask that doesn't really have descriptive details or context or place-based narrative. It might just be somebody says, were you alive during World War II? Well, if the answer is yes, there's nothing there to encourage the storyteller to tell his or her story. So in that case, it's important for the person doing the interviewing to really think about those questions that they're going to be asking before they sit down with the person, and think about how they can elicit the richest stories out of someone rather than just getting them to say yes or no. So what does this really mean? Do we have examples of some of those stories? Well, we're running out of time, but I do want to go through a couple of these just to give you a sense of what we're actually talking about.
Name, please?
Esmeralda.
Have you tried any sports, Esmeralda?
No.
Nothing at all. Have you done any swimming? Well, there's one sport. Have you done any bicycling? Skateboarding? Do you like swimming a lot? What do you like about that?
So I stopped it there because you do get the gist of what this one was about. Ultimately, what we're hearing happening in this story is that there's a lot of background noise, first and foremost, but that the interviewer is asking an exhibit goer, who happens to be a fourth grader in this case, if he has participated in a number of sports. The answer is either yes or no. So ultimately, there's no context or richness to his story. In this case, what we have is a great story, believe it or not. It's a terrific story, but the issue with this one is that the student storyteller is reading a script, which makes it seem a little less authentic.
Growing up in a rural community may not mean a lot to other people, but to us, it's our life. I live in a town where there is more livestock than people, and sometimes it can get really boring. I also think I pass more farm equipment than your average fuel-saving sedan. We are a community that thrives and survives on.
So again, you get the gist of this story as well. It's actually a really well-crafted story, but it's difficult to really feel the passion of the storyteller because in this case, the storyteller is reading a script. Now this one also, it's very easy to hear why this was included in our list of the good, the bad, and the ugly. There's just not much chance of even hearing what's happening in this story.
And can teach us how to do many things we wouldn't have an opportunity to, like leadership positions that in a larger place we would not have that opportunity to speak in front of groups, to hold public office.
So again, very difficult to hear the context of what the speaker is talking about. So in this instance, I believe that some of these stories are being collected actually in the Museum on Main Street exhibit space. So it's something to think about. This is a project that happens outside, independently of the exhibit, whether it's waterways, hometown teams, etc. So the likelihood that this might happen is perhaps a bit more slim, but the idea of having the story collectors think about background noise is really critical. So this one, again, not such a bad story, but ultimately when you think about it, if no one mentions a location, it makes it much less viable and much less interesting for the listeners.
My father owned the biggest grocery store in the region when I was a little boy, and we used to give away free candy on Halloween, and we were famous for doing this, and we always had 10 times more candy than anybody ever wanted because we bought it direct from the factory and bought half a truckload at a time. And one Halloween, sure enough, we ran out of candy and didn't have any in store to give away.
So this is actually a really charming story. It's a great story, but there's no mention of location. So it's difficult for us as listeners to really think about where the story was taking place, albeit, but that's one of the few detractions from this story because the storyteller is very passionate and provides those rich descriptive details. But together, think about how your stories that the students will be creating can work around some of these issues like yes or no questions, reading a script, excess background noise, etc. And if you think about these, eliminating those elements right from the start really help create a good story from the beginning. So we've left a minute or two for questions. If anyone is interested in sending questions via the chat panel that you see on my screen right here, feel free to, or you may unmute your mic to ask questions. Otherwise, Selwyn, is there anything else you'd like to wrap up with?
If there are no questions, I would certainly like to invite everyone to join us in 2 weeks, which will be the 7th of March. At 2 p.m. we will have our next webinar where we will actually be looking at some of the technology solutions briefly mentioned earlier. Are there any questions? And otherwise, thank you for listening in and watching, and hopefully these webinars are helpful.
Thank you all.